The official Vintage Guitar Magazine 2025 price guide has partnered with 33 of the top guitar dealers in the industry to provide the most accurate values for thousands of models. This includes electric guitars, acoustic guitars, basses, amplifiers, effects, mandolins, and banjos. Whether your instrument is an investment or simply a piece you enjoy playing, it's always helpful to know what it's worth. If you're checking out a guitar at your local shop and want to know its value before making the purchase, this guide is your go-to source for all the details. Available in both print and digital editions, you can have the guide right at your fingertips no matter where you go. Use code BUYGUITAR25 to receive 15% off the 2025 price guide when purchased directly from www.vintageguitar.com. Offer expires February 11th, 2025.
Hello and welcome to Buy That Guitar, presented by Vintage Guitar Magazine. I'm your host, Ram Tuli. This podcast is about the joy of guitar. That includes buying guitars, selling guitars, collecting guitars. We're talking vintage guitars, new guitars, used guitars, pre-war, flat tops, electric Spanish arch tops, custom shop guitars, limited edition guitars, basses, amps, effect pedals, lap steels, mandolins, banjo. If it has strings, we're going to talk about it. I've spent most of my life studying the vintage guitar market. It's truly something I love and I'm passionate about. I can talk guitars all day, and I'm going to. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another thrilling and exciting edition of Buy That Guitar. Today, I'm with my good friend, Collin Whitley, and we're going to talk to you about Rickenbackers. This is one I've been waiting to do for a long time, and I'm pretty excited about this. What about you, Collin? How are you doing today?
Doing fantastic, Graham. How are you?
Good. First of all, I want to introduce Collin. Among all the collectors that I'm friends with, Collin is one that I rely on a lot. Collin, we talk, at least twice to three times a year, and we talk about everything, but mainly Rickenbackers. And you're also been an essential offset fenders for me as well. But we're going to talk about Rickenbackers today. And Rickenbackers are a very hard guitar to analyze from a price point. And you've helped me because you're a collector. You've been collecting Rickenbackers and playing Rickenbackers pretty much since you were a teenager, right?
That's correct. Yeah. That's been the main guitar that's interested me for the longest time. And that was kind of my entryway into vintage guitars specifically was Rickenbackers. So.
Mm-hmm. And it's funny, I was going to call this show the jingly jangly sound of the 60s. But then you pointed out to me that most of the people playing Ricks today are not just about Beatles and the Byrds. There's a whole generation of music that came afterwards. And that was your generation.
I think that's exactly right. I'm 40 years old, and so I'm kind of right in between. I know a lot of guitar enthusiasts and collectors that are younger than me, and obviously plenty that are older. And I think that there's been a long narrative for many, many years about Rickenbackers, mostly from the baby boomer generation, that they are the first words that come out of their mouths are, oh, the Beatles, or oh, the Byrds.
Right.
And it's always the 60s band, and then, oh, the jingle jangle sound. And that's great. They definitely do that. But to those of us that maybe didn't grow up under that generation, we have maybe a broader influence of artists that led us to Rickenbacker than just the Beatles or the Byrds. I mean, I love a lot of the 60s artists, especially The Who. I kind of come from that side of things, of the bands like The Who and The Action and other Rickenbacker users that were kind of around back then, but not really the jangly Beatles and Byrds type of thing, but really like through all the 80s, like the Jam and the Smiths.
The Smiths. I think the Smiths, when I think of that jangly sound, the Smiths really, that's a signature of that and completely different than the Byrds. You know what I mean? But yet it's that jangly Rickenbacker sound.
Definitely. It's a real angular sound. It's not a blues rock guitar sound. And that's kind of what the appeal of Rickenbacker is to me. It's something different than that.
Right. Now, there's definitely been a changing perception of Rickenbackers. You know, they certainly are deeply connected to that 60s jangle. But, you know, the younger collectors such as you didn't grow up really listening to the Beatles, but you found a different way to paint a picture. So where did you play high school guitar in high school then? Is that how you really?
Yeah, I started playing guitar around 10 years old. I think pretty much most people my age, like most people that I speak with that are mid 30s to mid 40s, we all kind of have the same influence behind us. And that's pretty much watching Back to the Future 2 or Back to the Future and seeing Marty McFly with an ES345 and getting really excited about electric guitar in general, in addition to lots of music. But yeah, I got, started with a Squire Strat at 10 years old in the mid 90s until getting into, other types of guitars, eventually leading towards like vintage guitars.
Right. It was funny. Last week I had Fred Stuckey and we both, we're both the same age. And we talked about like when we were in high school, there was really two things that were happening. There was that mod music scene and there was the rockabilly scene. And that mod scene was really a Rickenbacker scene, right? And the rockabilly, of course, was Gretsch. So this season, I'm trying to talk about more than just Gibsons and Fenders. And Rickenbacker is definitely in the vintage guitar marketplace, Gretsch and Rickenbacker, they're unique. There are so many people that are just as passionate about Rickenbacker and Gretsch as they are guys like me that are passionate about Stratocasters and Telecasters. And it is a niche market, but it's a very hard to price market, isn't it?
That's certainly right. I think that there's a lot of interest in other brands. I love Fender and Gibson. Anybody's gone on like my Instagram page or anything like that could see, like, I love all that stuff as well. But I think that there's so much more out there and a lot more accessible options to people if you look kind of beyond those brands. And Rickenbacker, Gretsch, even like Mosrite, kind of like these off brands are really interesting, compelling guitars with a lot of history, a lot of appeal, but they're also available at prices that for many, many years, and even still in some cases, are only barely more than what the new version of that guitar costs or the reissue of that guitar costs.
Right.
And that's really appealing when you're looking at, hey, I can own a vintage guitar, I can own this vintage Rickenbacker, and it's within proximity of what a new one would cost. The new ones are fantastic. They're great guitars. They're definitely a great workhorse. If you're interested in sort of that historical aspect, you can pick up a vintage Rickenbacker for, a few $1,000s in some cases.
Right. Now, there's a reason most vintage guitars indexes, like the Vintage Guitar Price Guide, the Rickenbackers are very stagnant in those books. And that's because the published price histories are very broad. Sometimes they give the same price across an entire model line. Sometimes they give the same price for 1960 all the way to 1979. It's just insane because there just isn't a lot of data out there. And that's why I turned to you, because you are a collector and you know what is out there. And I think you pointed out to me that a lot of these brands trade hands privately. They're not sold on the open market. The stuff that's really valuable is a lot of times just changes hands without it ever being advertised or put out there.
Yeah, especially for the rarest items on the list. Yeah, definitely. But the market for Rickenbacker specifically is a lot more steady and slow growing than a lot of other brands. I think like certainly the last 4 or 5 years with COVID, there's a huge surge in prices, and prices on a lot of Rickenbackers went up as well, but they didn't triple like a lot of Fender or Gibson models did. Like they didn't triple in value. So sometimes in the guides, which you've taken a lot of strides connecting with people to get the right input now on a lot of these, I think the numbers on a lot of these guitars in the guides have been off in the past because they're rare, and a lot of the dealers that or people that were put in the past didn't actually have hands-on experience with some of these models. With Rickenbacker, you're talking a normal batch size for a vintage Rickenbacker guitar in the 50s or 60s is like 50 guitars or less. Some cases it's 25. There's certain models they made half a dozen of, and so it's really difficult in that context to get an accurate price around them, and then how to track that price year over year when it could be 3 or 4 years until one of those turns up on the market. It's really a challenge at that point to keep an eye on it if you're not involved in that market all the time and or relying on great sources like yours to get that type of input now.
I think the first thing I really did when I took over the guide, I had to educate myself on Rickenbacker. I really had to educate myself because I've never played a Rickenbacker. I didn't know anything about them. And I think I reached out to you, and we probably met through like the Rick resource page or through Facebook or something. And I remember we just spent hours talking. And I'm confident for this 2025 guide that we nailed it, that we got the model numbers right. We got the production numbers right, because I had prices for stuff that was never, they had 3 or 4 made. Then you can't put a price on that.
You had certain items in there that they only had one of that were just a complete prototype. And there's no way you can get a price around that.
Right. I often get people telling me, oh, I have the one of, you don't have it in your book. And I said, well, sell it and tell me what you got for it and I'll put it in.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. And even to complicate things even more, there have been certain resources in the past, certain books. There was a great book years ago by Richard Smith, which until Martin Kelly's amazing book that came out a couple of years ago about Rickenbacker, this Richard Smith book was the go-to for all of information. Well, they published production records in the back of it, but they were incomplete records. And so it would be, sometimes those would be misleading and people would say, well, I have one of 6 made according to this book. Well, that book is not necessarily accurate. And so after something's been around for 30 or 40 years, that becomes the word, to people.
Like I said, this year, I think a lot of pain was taken to make sure that the production numbers were taken into account and stuff was removed, condensed, consolidated, actual real pricing was put in. One of the things about Rickenbacker that is confuses everybody is just the huge number of model numbers, and nothing really correlates. You know what I mean? It's like, it's insane trying to figure out what came before. So that's kind of one of the things that you helped me really focus on was what came when, and it turns out that I think the way you pointed out, is that the body shape is everything, right? It's not so much the model number. It's not so much the historically classified, whatever it is. It's really the body styles that matter.
That's correct. Yeah, I think it's body styles, but originally it was trim packages. So just like Gibson, say for ES models, they would have the ES 355 top of the line, ES 345 kind of and then the ES 335. Rickenbacker had the deluxe version, that was the 360 model, and then they had the 330 if we're talking hollow bodies, and then within those the model number could change. It would add 10 if you added a middle pickup to go from a 360 to a 370. You would add 5 if there's a vibrato, becoming a 375.
Right.
But really it all boils down to a couple of different versions. The 360 and 330 are really good comparison points because people will say, oh, I love the 360 body shape, and I'll just say, well, which one? There were 6 of them,
Well, here's how complicated it is, and this is why I couldn't figure it out. Gruhn's Vintage Guide has a chart that shows you that, let's say, for the thin hollow body double cutaway with the pointed horns, bass horns slightly longer than the treble, there's really 4 different models. And you start with the 12 3/4 inch wide, which is the small body. And you have a 3/4 scale neck, which is the 310, the 315, the 320, and the 325. And that goes up in order by 2 pickups with a vibrato, 3 pickups, and then 3 pickups with a vibrato. Then you get a full scale of that 12 3/4 wide. And that's where the 350 and the 355 come in. And that's with 3 pickups or 3 pickups and a vibrato. And then you go to the wide body, the 15 1/4 inch wide. And then you get a standard trim and a deluxe trim. So the standard trims go 330, 335, 340, 345, going from 2 pickups to vibe, 3 pickups to vibe. And then the deluxe trim is 360, 365, 370, 375. So to me, I was always just confused, like, what the hell? And I finally got to where if it ends in a 5, it's got a vibrato on it. And that's all you really got to,
Correct, yeah. And from there, it's really about, like you said, it's the body shape. So I think most people that are well-versed in Rickenbackers, it's anything that's kind of has that 325 body shape, the small body, John Lennon type model, that's its own model family, and that has offshoots, 315 and the 310 without a vibrato or a middle pickup, or the 350 with a long neck, but it's still that body shape. But then you have the 330 body shape that dominated through the mid 60s. That also had like earlier origins as the 360, the double bound version.
Right.
And like the George Harrison type of body, the double bound OS model, they call it, old style. And then
we're going to go through all that because the market likes certain models and certain trim packages, so we'll talk about that in detail. I guess let's go back to the very beginning. In order to do the history of Rickenbacker, there's really 3 Rickenbacker eras. There's that they invent the guitar, the electric guitar, right? And that's for a different time. We won't talk about that. We're going to concern ourselves with everything that happens after our buddy F.C. Hall shows up and buys the company in 1953. And I would love to write a book or do a documentary on Los Angeles in the 1950s, and we'll call it the Guitar Wars. Where they get all the people, the Bigsby's and the Leo Fenders and the Les Pauls involved. All these guys fighting over this guitar, the solid body guitar, right? And F.C. Hall and his history, he really helped Leo Fender. There's no doubt about he put Leo Fender on the map. He was the radio tel guy. F.C. Hall, Don Randall, Charlie Hayes, and Leo Fender. This was the first company that basically sold Fender. Like that was how Fender got his stuff to the market. It was through the agreements with F.C. Hall.
That's right.
Well, F.C. Hall basically bit a little bit too much off, as they say, and he got on the wrong side of Don Randall and Leo Fender when he bought this little company that just made, it was called Electro. They just made lap steels, basically, and amplifiers, And he saw what was going on with the Telecaster or the Broadcaster Telecaster, and he says, I can compete with that. Let's get rid of these Hawaiian guitars, and let's get into the solid body electric Spanish guitars, And that's kind of where everything kind of goes haywire for F.C. Hall. He kind of goes and he buys Rickenbacker. But that's kind of like the story beginning of one of the greatest guitar stories of all time, because just what they did, like what Leo Fender and Don Randall did to him, basically threw him out on his rear end, right? But he had the last laugh, didn't he?
Yeah, and it's amazing to me that the history with Rickenbacker goes back so far that, like, that's why I'm always entertained when people just bring up the Beatles, because I think, well, there's 40 years before that point of Rickenbacker history. They invented the solid body electric guitar in 1932.
Right. They had their 25th anniversary guitar before the Telecaster came out. Okay, people?
Exactly. It goes way back. Their history touches pretty much every major company in Southern California or West Coast guitar making. I mean, it touches obviously Fender. Leo Fender was brilliant. He needed a business partner, and that's FC Hall was a brilliant businessman. And so that's where that relationship came from, but also the people that worked at the early days of Electro String, the factory that FC Hall had purchased and started producing Rickenbacker guitars from. At that factory, in the mid-50s, Paul Barth worked there for a minute, and who later worked with Magnatone. Also, Simi Mosley worked there briefly before going off to Moserite.
Yep.
Yeah, and so there's all this cross-pollination from different people. And then Roger Rossmeisel comes over from, initially he works at Gibson shortly after coming over in the 1950s, and then he goes over to Rickenbacker and really kind of finds a great home there.
Right, that's a great story too, Rossmeisel. If you ever read what McCarty thought of him.
Oh, I bet.
He brought him in specifically because I think he wanted him to revamp the L5 line. And I think he was not impressed. And then I think, doesn't Rossmeisel go to Hawaii for a trip, comes back, and doesn't even come back. He just winds up going to see FC Hall. And that, we talk about Leo Fender, McCarty. We talked last week about Jimmy Webster, right? But now you got it. When you talk about the other guitar genius in Southern California, Roger Rossmeisel and FC Hall.
Oh, and I would even give it, FC Hall, amazing things for the company on the business side and was very, very sharp. Roger Rossmeisel was the heart and soul of these guitars and their designs. If you look at what was being produced before he came along and then what came after, everything that we associate with Rickenbacker, from the cat's eye sound hole to the body shapes to the way that they're constructed and the ramp carve for the tailpiece, all of these details and more all came from Roger Rossmeisel. The German carve and all that.
He was definitely there. He was definitely at Gibson when they did the Les Paul. He was there, so he saw that carved top. And there's no doubt that when they did the first combos, that carved top was something big, that was taken, I think, directly from that. But the combo was the first solid body, but it was, just think of the ingenious way that they did this. They basically carve out or dig out the back of the thing, so it's not fully solid.
Yeah, that's one of the unique features of Rickenbacker. I can't think of any other guitar where the neck is set in from the back, and then has a 1/4-inch cap of wood on the backside of it, which makes resetting the necks really tricky and difficult.
Right, we'll talk about that a little bit. Yeah. But also, they were the first ones to do the whole neck that goes through the body, and then they throw those 2 tulip pieces on for the very first 400 they made like in 57. Nobody did that.
Yes.
Nobody did a neck through body like that for a solid body.
Quite innovative at the time, yeah.
Right. And that's why these guitars are so unique and so different, and they have such a unique sound because of that. And talk about the sustain you get from a neck through body, solid body. So I guess the next thing is so we get to the scoop back. Did they bolt the necks or did they glue the necks? I don't know what they did with these first combos.
And I believe all the way from the beginning. I don't think they've ever had a bolt-in neck completely bolted.
So they were always glued in?
Yeah, I believe so.
But the thing is, these first combos, they're very clunky because they still have that horseshoe pickup. But that gets, by the 400, they start putting in the new, what we call the toaster tops. Is that what we call them? Toaster top?
Yeah, the toaster pickups. They had the Armin pickups before that, which sound great. They're definitely a different sound than the iconic toaster pickup that's still in production today. That's essentially the same design.
And then they get the tulip bodies, and then they go to the sweeping crescent for the 650s, 850s. He introduces this double truss rod system.
Oh yeah,
which has befuddled luthiers from then on, right? I mean, how many people have had their guitar ruined because someone didn't know that this was a double truss rod system?
I think Rickenbacker did things resolutely their own way. Yeah. They were not interested in doing anything that other companies were doing in terms of construction or design, including the double truss rod. And they had rationale for why they did that. The thinking with the double truss rod is that it gives you a little bit more ability to dial in the action on the treble or the bass side, and it's just it's a completely different design than a Fender or a Gibson rod. If you just twist it, you'll pop the fretboard right off the neck, and that's a mess. So you have to really understand Rickenbackers. It's a totally different construction language than the other guitars.
The main categories of the Rickenbacker models, it's really hard to understand this if you're not a Rickenbacker person. We're going to try to explain to somebody who does not know anything about Rickenbackers, but they want a vintage guitar. And they want something, maybe they do want that jangly sound. Maybe they do have a Beatles, or they love listening to the Smiths, and these are historically classified by specs that give you the model numbers, as we talked before. But it's the body shape, because the body shape changes between these model numbers, even between the same model numbers, and that is the biggest determinant of value.
Yes, definitely, by far.
And that's mainly because of George Harrison and John Lennon, but George Harrison. So when it comes to the 360, there's one that we call old style and there's one that's called new style. Can you explain to somebody why the old style is worth so much more money than the new style?
Well, the old style was only made from 1961. They came out with it, and they didn't call it the old style at that time. It was a new body shape, and yeah, it was double bound. And then they didn't introduce 12 strings until December of 1963. They were Rickenbackers pre-Beatle era weren't sold in huge numbers, so they're fairly rare to begin with. And then Rickenbacker found themselves in immense amount of luck because John Lennon was already playing a Rickenbacker. George Harrison had already bought a solid body on a trip to America. And so they found themselves in a position where the most popular band on the planet was using their guitars. And so they found an opportunity to get in front of the Beatles and present them with some instruments. And that's when they gave George Harrison a double bound 12 string. Obviously that turned into a phenomenon and everybody associates that guitar with George Harrison. Well, the interesting thing is that was a prototype 12 string. By the time that model was available to the public in October of 1964, in their infinite wisdom, FC Hall decided to, hey, let's redesign the body entirely. So all those people that went and saw Hard Day's Night, 1964, got out of the theater, went to their nearest store, ordered a Rickenbacker 360 12 string, and then got this round top, totally different version. But throughout the 60s, from 64 onwards, they would still offer the double bound body, the OS or old style body, but it was a special order only. So you would see them in much smaller numbers. There's a lot more 6 strings out there, but there are a handful of 12 strings. And so like anything that's custom ordered, special ordered, just the numbers are drastically less than anything else. And that's why they're rare, because anybody that wants a 60s era George Harrison type guitar will have to pay dearly for it.
Right. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. I want you to picture the Beatles come to America. They're here for their first concert tour, and they're going to go on Ed Sullivan. FC Hall gets to them before Don Randall does.
Yeah.
He gets to them, and that is everything. That's why your Stratocaster is worth a fortune, people, because FC Hall busted his rear end, got to see the Beatles, and got that 360 12 into the hands of George Harrison in his hospital bed or whatever it was, in his hotel bed because he was sick.
He even brought some amps, too, but they weren't too interested in using those, because Rickenbacker made a lot of amps back in the day, too. People don't really know that.
But that's just amazing to me. And it wasn't until the 1969 that Don Randall finally got the Beatles to take Fender Silverface amps.
Yeah.
When they do the concert on the rooftop, those are Fender Silverface. Don Randall finally got them gave them the amps. And they finally took them.
Fender was more interested in country western artists than rock and roll bands from England. So yeah, kudos to FC Hall, and it's an amazing history story right there that has worked out very well for the brand over the years.
You know what? Let's talk about this vibrato. Everybody knows that Leo Fender had a partner named Kaufman. Doc Kaufman. I don't know if people realize that Doc Kaufman invented the Rickenbacker, the first vibrato. Those come on Rickenbacker guitars, right? Up till about 1962, right?
They sure did. Usually a little bit earlier than that. You mostly see them into 1960, but I guess there's rare occasions where they'd use it after that. But yeah, very clunky design. They were often removed from those guitars, such as John Lennon, and something more usable.
And that's why John Lennon's his 325 has a Bigsby on it. It does not have this horrible Kaufman on it. I shouldn't say horrible. Do you have a collection that has some of the Kaufmans on them?
I don't personally, no.
So you don't really...
I have a guitar with I have a 1964 export model 325 that has an accent vibrato, but not the...
Those are very similar, I believe, kind of like to the old combs that Gibson was using on their specials.
Yeah, well, the accent vibrato was actually designed by a guy named Paul Butts, who also designed the Gibson unit. They were designed by the same person. The Lyre Vibrola, Gibson Deluxe Vibrola, same exact unit, really, from the front half upwards. You can exchange the arms on those two. They work fine.
Now, when it comes to Rickenbacker units, like for a Gibson, if something comes with a vibrato, it usually knocks it down in value. Is that the same with Rickenbacker?
Not necessarily. Some models, it may even improve the value a little bit, but it's not as big of a factor. I think it really depends on what that model is and what that model should have. Like all the export models, for example, that went to the UK, except for the solid body and the bass, they all had, and the 12 string, they all had an accent vibrato. So that's generally will improve the value if one of those guitars still has it on there. But it's not like Gibson where there's a flat Bigsby compared to a stop tail, or a big downturn that has like a Maestro sideways compared to a stop tail.
Another weird anomaly is with the Gibson, the customs usually sell for less than the standards. There's just like this I don't know what it is, but the more ornate the thing is for us Les Paul players, the less desirable it is. Like the 355 versus the 345 versus the 335. Everybody wants that 335. They don't want the bells and whistles. Is that the same with Rickenbacker? Do you want a 370 or do you want a 360 or do you want a 330?
Well, just to start off, I own all of those Gibson models. I love them all. So I think they're great. And I even like them. The fancier, the better. But with Rickenbacker, and you could even say this about the Gibsons, the biggest determinant on the price is artist association. What famous artist used that model? A lot of times an artist wouldn't necessarily go for the most expensive, over-the-top deluxe version of a guitar. They would go for the less expensive, middle-of-the-road type of spec. And that's why the 335 is so popular and sold so many. They were less expensive. Same kind of thing with Rickenbacker. I don't think it really makes as big of a difference with the deluxe features or not these days. The price gap is not that substantial. I do have a 370 model with the deluxe inlays and all that. They each kind of offer something different.
You prefer one that has the shark fin inlays and the double bound?
Oh, it depends on the model. My favorite model, we can get into this, I'm sure, is the model 1993 export. This is a 12-string. It's a 12-string dot inlaid F-hole, the double-bound body that was shipped to England. They only made 100 of them in about 18-month span. That's my favorite model, but I really do love the way that all the deluxe features look as well. Like I also have a 1969 model 381 Maple Glow, which was Rickenbacker's top of the line. It's got the German carve. It's got the deluxe inlays, the checkered bindings, all that stuff in one guitar, and it's just a nice package.
We might as well just get into it right now. The Rose Morris stuff, that's kind of like where it's at. Like that's for Rickenbacker people. The Rose Morris, I think those have the biggest returns, out of all the different models you come. And it's mainly that 1993 RM.
Yeah, it's definitely been a very popular one for a long time. That's also one of those where the value has climbed on them, but the values were misquoted so low in the past that it looks like the jump is higher than it really is because we were
late getting the right. I was like befuddled that I didn't know that the S and the RMs, called the export models, were the RMs. There was like pricing was very similar, and we were kind of I was caught off guard, not understanding that the export models really were the ones that people wanted.
It's something special. Yeah, it has the case with the little badge on the front, and just the whole story that it was shipped to London in the 60s during the most famous era for Rickenbacker guitars. There's just really a cool history story there, and also that they're relatively rare, depending on which model it is. They didn't import the same quantities of each of those, so it's a lot easier to get, say, a 335S, which was the model 1997, 2 pickups and a vibrato. It's a lot easier to get that, or the 3 pickup 1998 345S model, than it is to find like the short scale model 1996, or especially the 12-string model 1993 that they only did for a very short period, or also the 1999 solid body bass, which is a 4001S model. They were only imported in for a couple of years, very few after that point from 64 and 65, and then a couple afterwards in 66. And that's it. And so the scarcity really drives out. Also, if you look down the list of players of these Rose Morris models, there's all kinds of famous names. And it's obviously the most famous of them being Pete Townsend of The Who, who famously had a lot of them. And he went through 8 Rickenbackers just to set the record straight. Only 8 Rickenbackers, not hundreds, not dozens, 8 total through his whole 1960s era. But, he's so associated with them through photos and everything. But also, think how many bass players played the 4001S, the model 1999. You have, Pete Quaife from the Kinks. You have Roger Waters from early Pink Floyd played that.
McCartney, I guess, is the one we always point to. Then all the 70s bands, all the Deep Purples they were all, that's 4001 there.
The official Vintage Guitar Magazine 2025 price guide has partnered with 33 of the top guitar dealers in the industry to provide the most accurate values for thousands of models. This includes electric guitars, acoustic guitars, basses, amplifiers, effects, mandolins, and banjos. Whether your instrument is an investment or simply a piece you enjoy playing, it's always helpful to know what it's worth. If you're checking out a guitar at your local shop and want to know its value before making the purchase, this guide is your go-to source for all the details. Available in both print and digital editions, you can have the guide right at your fingertips no matter where you go. Use code BUYGUITAR25 to receive 15% off the 2025 price guide when purchased directly from www.vintageguitar.com. Offer expires February 11th, 2025.
People listening, they want to know what they're going to have to pay to get into the game here, as they say. So let's talk about the 310, the 315, the 320, and 325. From 58 to 1960, these small body, they are thick bodies, right?
Yes, Capri models.
Capri, we call them Capri, and it was named after a dog, not an island.
A cat. It was actually
a cat.
FC
I'm sorry,
Hall's
a cat. Yes.
Yeah.
So from 58 to 60, so these small bodies, they're about 15K now, right? You're going to pay 15 to 20K. Right,
for a later one, yeah, for one with an F hole, especially if it's like a 310 or a 315, which they made kind of in 1959 era. But it was kind of a quirky model that, to be honest, it would have likely been discontinued had John Lennon not walked into a shop in Hamburg and that's just happened to be what they had behind the counter and purchased one.
It was there because nobody wanted it. It was just it was unplayable for a lot of people.
Well, his guitar in particular was a show guitar. It had been used at a NAMM show or like a dealer show, and there's photos of it, behind in the background where that particular guitar just got then sent later to Germany along with another one. It's just a series of fortunate events, just like FC Hall going to New York and giving George Harrison a 12 string and that whole history. They got lucky first with John Lennon happened to purchase this guitar in Germany and used it to great effect for many years.
So John Lennon's 325, it's a 58, it's an early one. We estimate that 8 were made, and we know of 6, right, that are actually out there.
Yeah, I don't think the 8 were made. There's 6 there's 6 known solid top models, and that's the key distinction. It's that it has a solid top.
It does not have the F holes in it.
Yeah, it doesn't have an F hole, and also within that batch, a couple of them were a shaded top. They were like an early kind of sunburst, and so
Lennon's was natural.
His was natural. Was I think it was alder body. So it's extremely rare. I think they're generally considered to be prototypes, all of them. So there's only a handful of them out there.
Some do come to market. I know of one that came to market last year. What would I expect today if I wanted to buy one? If I really had to have one, what would I have to pay? Over 150?
You're definitely well into the 6 figures. Like that, because of their rarity, it's very difficult to put a precise price on it because it depends on the seller and the timing, and there's so many other factors. Getting somebody to sell one of those in the first place, they're definitely well into the 6 figures, something like that.
I think in the book right now I have them at 150 to 250, and the one that's for sale right now that I could actually, if somebody really wanted it, I know where it's at. The guy wants almost $1 million.
Yeah,
almost.
I believe I know of the one you're talking about.
Yeah. I'm surprised that there aren't people out there that said, yeah, I'll pay that because what the heck. But I think in the book, to put a book value, because there are some that they do show up once in a while. 150 to 250 is in the book, but the real price, to get one to market, you would expect to have to pay way over that.
I think the only factor that matters there is how much the buyer really wants it and how quickly the seller wants to let it go, because that's just how rare they are. With only 6 of them made, and one of them being John Lennon's, and that's not going to be for sale at any point soon. So,
right. Where is that guitar now? Is it still in Yoko Ono's private collection?
I believe so. Yeah, it was on display in Japan for years, if I recall correctly. But I believe that she has that back in her possession. It might be on display somewhere. It kind of pops up from time to time on display places. But yeah, it's still with the Lennon family.
So 325, it was made a little bit after that. Let's say 1959, it has the F holes in it. Those are now 30,000 to 38,000 is what we have in the book. Do you know if any of those have come to market anytime recently?
Recently being within past several years. Yeah, I think some of those have come to market, and that would be kind of on the high end of the range. I think sometimes they're even a little bit less than that, but yeah, they're exceedingly rare, so they're going to be in that sort of price range for sure.
So, let's say 310, 315, 320, you could expect to pay well over 10K, probably 15K for a really, really nice Capri body, thick body.
Easily, yeah.
Easily
$15,000.
And then when the body thins a little bit, 64, we go to the thinner body.
Yeah, because they didn't make that model between 1959 and then 1964 when John Lennon had become famous already. So they
remake them in 64. That's when John Lennon gets the second one, the black one. They now know a good thing. They now FC Hall knows, let's make these things. Everybody wants them. Yeah, and exactly. Today you have to pay about $6,500 for that now, right?
Yeah, depending on the year. Yeah, I think earlier ones are worth a little bit more, like a 64. I don't really know if there are any domestic model 64s. I think they're all export Rose Morris, and those are going to be pushing $9,500, $10,000 sometimes for a really nice one. But yeah, for a little bit later in the 60s, like a 67 or 68, yeah, $6,500 on the low end, usually 75 or 8.
And then we get to the 330, which is now the bigger body, wider body. those are 9K now, 9 to 12, 58, 59, 60, the thick body capris.
Yeah, for the Capri models, yes, exactly.
And then in 1965, they come back out. Same thing. They stopped making them. And then in 65, they now have a market because everybody's buying them.
Yeah.
And you get a thinner body.
Yeah, the body changed entirely. And those early thick body Capri models, there's not a huge price gap between the basic feature dot inlay non-bound body and the bound with the deluxe inlays and all that. There's not a huge price gap between those two, a little bit sometimes. It depends on the color and condition and all those factors. But yeah, I mean, those are kind of in the same bracket. But then it gets a lot more affordable if you're looking at a 330 from 1965 onward when they brought it back out.
And now, they also made what they call the full body. Although do you see a lot of the full bodies out there?
The 360 bodies, what they call it, 330F, 360F, etc. Yeah, they're around. They don't seem to go out on the open market that often, but they're definitely around. Rickenbacker made a fair number of them, kind of in the 1958 to 1960 range. There might be, I think there's a couple that were made after that point, but
the price just seems high, but I don't see, to me, I'm trying to think of, if you were going to buy a 330, wouldn't you want the one that, looked like with the horns or with the round horns? Then they tend to get with this big full body thing that kind of looks, I don't know, it probably looks like they made like a regular guitar.
I love them. Those 360F or 330F, the big wide, I would prefer that over a 330, but that's, once you get further and further into Rickenbackers, that could kind of be something to look for. I've had a couple and they don't necessarily always play that great because of the way that they're constructed. Sometimes they're wonderful. So we really have to just find a good one.
And then the 360 Capri body, thick 12K, easy. But then you get to the new Capri, which is a bound body. They call it a new Capri in 61. So here they actually keep these in production. So 1958, 1960, Capri thick body, about 12K on up. And then you get the 61 to 63 new Capri, which is a bound body. And these go down, they drop a little bit, 8 to about 12K.
That's about right.
What's the difference between this new Capri and the Capri?
I'm not exactly sure why they redesigned the body, but I believe it was for a little bit better balance. If you play an early Capri body, big thick body, if you're seated, they're tail heavy. They sort of fall off of your knee as you're seated, whereas the later body is a little bit slimmer and a little bit more comfortable. There was a lot of brands at that time, though, that were introducing slim body guitars. Gibson had this big thick body, arch tops, and then it came out with the thin body series and the ES. I think eventually that trickled into Rickenbacker, and they thought, okay, well, the market's looking for something that's a little bit more comfortable, a little bit thinner, and easier to play.
Right. And then 64, they just go to the new style body. It's important to point out, it's the same wood blank. They use everything. It's almost the same. It isn't a lot of effort to round up these curves. They just take off the points, but it's the same blank body. But that drops you about $5,500 is what it'll cost to get into that.
Pretty substantial. Yeah. Also, just supply and demand. Those guitars came out after the Rickenbacker 12-string was the hottest thing around, and everybody wanted one. They sold tons and tons of them in that time period. In terms of Rickenbacker numbers, I mean, their numbers are always smaller than Fender or Gibson, but they made a lot of those new style 360 type bodies with a rounded top.
And between 65 and 70, you could order an old style body. And if you're a collector, you hope that somebody did order one and you found it, because you could get into that around $8,000 now. It's about $3,000 more.
Yeah, for a 6-string model. Yeah. That's kind of where they tend to start.
We'll talk separately about the 12-string. That's a whole different animal. Can you how when they talk about fakes, could somebody take a 360 body, like an old style body, and put a 12-string neck on it?
They certainly could. Yes. I mean, they're compatible. You'd have to know how to get a 12-string neck out of one body and into another without damaging anything. But yeah, it's certainly possible. It's happened. I've seen it.
So there's no, if you took it apart, there's no like tool markings or anything that would tell you that you had a 12-string, that was actually started life as a 6-string? There
would probably be markings inside the control cavity that would tell you that. And there would also be other clues like the tail piece. Like most of the 12-strings always had, in that era, always had an R tail piece. And so it has a couple screws, whereas a lot of the 6-strings had an accent vibrato and the mounting holes in a different place. There's little tells if you really knew what you're looking at, that you could help determine that. But also there'll be markings inside the control cavity, usually for a 12-string, that say something to the effect of it being a 12-string. And then also the serial number, if it's a known example, usually they're in small batches, or it'll be within a range that people already know and are already aware of.
So let's go to the 12 string, the 360-12, which is probably the most famous Rickenbacker. Everybody should own one, I think. If you wanted a 1964, guess what? There's only two of them there. One belongs to Harris, one belongs to the lady that used to play at the Stardust in Vegas. Does she still have that guitar?
No, Susie Arden, and actually hers and Harrison's are 63s.
63s, okay.
They were both made at the tail end of 63. Susie Arden's was made a little bit earlier than that. It has some earlier features, gold guards and things like that. No, she sold the guitar back in the 90s, and it's traded hands a few times since then, including a couple of dealers. But yeah, that's it. If you wanted a 63 12-string, there was a few of them made in 64, including one for Jerry Marsden of the Pacemakers. Was ordered by Brian Epstein around the same time that he ordered the second Lennon 325. So yeah, there's a couple of them out there, but they generally all have history, and it's not something that is usually available until 1965, I would say.
Right. So 64 to 69. Well, if somebody did order an old style, would be Maple Glow or Fire Glow, which people want.
Fire Glow for sure.
For sure. George Harrison.
Again, it's all about the Artists Association.
Right.
There's a big price gap between a Maple Glow or any Maple Glow or even later in the 60s Jet Glow compared to Fire Glow is the one that everybody wants.
So Fire Glow, same guitar. If it's Fire Glow, it's going to be $25K. If it's a Maple Glow, it's about $20K.
Yeah, that's about right. And even higher, I know of several Fire Glow 360-12 double bound OS models that have sold up and around 30,000.
And these do come up for sale, but you never know about it. One of the benefits of having my job is the dealers always send me their list of what they sold that month, so I can keep accurate number of what things cost. And every once in a while, I'll see 65 old style 360-12, and I'm like, wait, why didn't you tell me you had this? Yeah, why didn't you tell me you had this?
Things like that move quickly. And if you think about it, like guitar collectors in general, and I know this because I collect every type of, or a lot of different types of guitars. Like if you're a well-rounded collector and you have, let's say, all big money blue chip kind of guitars, and you have your Les Pauls and your Telecasters and your pre-CVS Strats and all these things, I feel like a collection is not complete unless you have like one nice Gretsch and then like a Rickenbacker 12-string, and that's like the well-rounded. You have all of those sonic tools in your arsenal, so to speak. It's important, and I think for a lot of people, especially if you're a collector at that level, you're going to want the one closest to George Harrison's, if that's the thing that really has the most collector value.
Right. And that 65, I mean, these things go for well over 30K. So, if you're in on it and you can find out about it, you're going to bid on it with somebody, you're going to be paying over 30K for one of these, for a real one. That's why I advise you, make sure it's not somebody took a 360 body and stuck a 12 string, neck on it.
Yeah. I always tell people they reach out to me. I'm happy to take a look at photos or anything, because I don't want anybody buying something. And that's one of the problems, because Rickenbackers are rare. A lot of the mainstream dealers don't necessarily handle that many of them, and I've seen a lot of things slip through the cracks that like they just weren't looking for because it's kind of off their radar a little bit. So it doesn't happen that much. There's not as many cases out there of things being sort of manipulated compared to other brands, but it's happened.
Yeah. Now let's talk about the Rose Morse models. The most important is the 1993, and that is basically the Rose Morse. That's like the export version of that. I guess it'd be the 330-12, not the 360-12, because there's just no ornamentation. Why did they not put slashes? Why did they have to put F holes on there?
I think Rose Morse thought that the traditional buyers in England would want a more traditional sound hole. So instead of the wild cat's eye, they thought, well, let's just put a traditional F hole on there, which ended up becoming the defining feature of the Rose Morris models. That's really, and that 12 string that you're referring to, the 1993, they're also unique because it's a combination of features that aren't in any other Rickenbacker model, where you have a unbound dot fretboard with a double bound body. It's very unique. And they only made 100 of them, maybe 4 batches of 25 guitars each.
Right. So like the first ones, the people that you'll pay 25 if it's got the flat tailpiece on it. Right?
In some cases, much more. Yeah, I have one of those.
Much more. But what do you think? 25 of those were made?
Only 25 were made with a flat tailpiece, and then the rest of them all had an R tailpiece and a pointy truss rod cover.
And that one's about 22 to 30K easy.
Yeah, so somewhere in there. Yeah, mid 20s would be a reasonable figure to point out.
I like that R tailpiece. That looks cool. But I know that from you hear people talk about how easily they break.
That's the later ones tend to break, like in the 1980s and onwards. The early 60s, our tailpiece was made of a very heavy cast brass, and so it's a different construction. They don't break like the original one. I've never seen a 60s one break ever.
Do you know where they got that R from? I mean, it's Rickenbacker, of course.
Yeah, I heard some story about the Washington Redskins.
Yes, that was the R that was on the Redskins baseball cap, the cap that the coach would wear, or the
nice.
They would sit on the sidelines, and that's that R. I don't know why they didn't get sued for that, but that R is the Redskins R,
and it's still being used today. It's amazing. That's such a cool touch.
And so, I mean, there are some Rosemore stuff that sell for $8K above that. The 1996, which is the 325, of course. So that'd be the next most sought after one, I would assume.
Yeah, from price perspective, it would be after the 1993 12 string would be the 1999 4001S base, and then the 1996 short scale.
And then the 1995, which is the 615, that's actually that's like a 35 to 5K guitar. Not bad, right? That's a good.
Yeah, it's a great value if you can find one. That's the only Rose Morris model that isn't differentiated, guitar model that isn't differentiated from its domestic version in any way. And they were so unpopular that a bunch of those got shipped back from the UK. They just couldn't sell them. Rose Morris couldn't move those, and so they're still. I can't think of anybody famous that's played one except for the guitar player for the Ruddles. I think used a 1995 model, which is kind of their claim to fame at this point. Yeah. They're cool guitars for sure, but they're a bargain.
Let's rank these now. So as far as the marketplace is concerned, when it comes to Rickenbackers, and if you want to get yourself into a Rickenbacker, what we're going to tell you. So the most expensive model you could get, of course, is the 58 John Lennon solid top, well over $100,000. But you can get in a little bit under that with the 58 F-hole version of 325. That can be 40K, 50K. And then you come next to the Model 36012 with the pointed horns. Fire Glow 60s.
Yeah.
That's a 25 on up. I'll tell you, you're going to pay well over 30 for that, no doubt. If somebody has one and he's willing to let go, you're going to be paying.
It depends if it's earlier 60s or later. In 67, they moved from a 3-piece top to a 2-piece top. And so those later ones are a little bit less expensive, but I've known several of those that have sold for under 30,000, but it's, either way, it's up there for sure.
And then the next one, of course, is the 12 string that came from Ross Morris, the 1993 we're talking about. The flat tail piece one will be about 25K up. The R tail piece will be about 22K up. And then comes like just a Model 310, which is a thick body. So here you can get something in about 15, on up. 315, late thick body, 15. And then here shows one that shows up. We didn't even talk about this. The light show, the 331. Do you own any light shows?
I do, yeah. In fact, I've owned a half dozen or so of them. I own a nice one of 1972.
So that's the Type 2? Is that the Type 2 they call it? Or is it
Type 1? It's the Type 2. They only made the Type 1 for a very short while in 1970 and early 71. And I think they realized that there were some shortcomings in the circuit, redesigned it so that it gave a better light show, and it also didn't warm up as much as the earlier version did.
And the first version, could you feel that thing burning your arm there, or was it?
I think that there's been several guitar books that have kind of misrepresented how hot these guitars get, because they don't warm up enough to burn you in any way. And in fact, it's not even the top of the guitar that gets hot. It's the backside of it, because there's a heat sink inside where all the wiring goes to, and that can kind of get warm, and you could feel it a little bit from the backside, but they're not going to singe your arm or anything playing one. They're not that hot.
Right. So the earliest versions are a little cheaper, about 10 plus, and then you're going to pay about 12 plus for the one that came with the Type 2 that was a little better design. When you play, do you actually play with that? Did you actually take it out and play it?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't gigged in quite a while, but yeah, I would take that out. They're actually fantastic guitars. I mean,
so they do have tone. Like, I'd be worried like the tone be kind of goofy or the hollow or.
No, they sound great.
They look good and they sound great. Can you imagine how much fun that would be?
It's nice for playing something live, and like, you keep the lights off, and then right before your guitar break, you can twist that knob and turn the lights on. It's a cool little party trick. But I think they're really cool guitars. They're also one of the few examples of where a later version of something is worth a little bit more than the earlier version, like just because it was a better. And they only made those guitars for 2.5 years, or maybe less than that actually. So they're all pretty rare in general, but. That's also an unusual one because they've gone somewhat down in value over the past 15 years, 20 years that I've been watching them. I think at one point before the economic crash in '08, they were regularly, you'd see them at 20, 25. Nowadays, you could pick a good one up for like 15 or so, or under in a lot of cases.
Now, I'll tell you from an investment standpoint, you're not going to make any money. In fact, the rate of inflation is better than the rate of return of these light shows.
Yeah, but the rate of return of joy is extremely high.
That's it. That's what you're buying, man. You're buying the joy. So, but let's round this out. So the rest of the 370s, 360s, 350, these now the ones that have early 60, as long as they're bound bodies, they're all 8K plus, and that's I think that's where a lot of people. You want a Rickenbacker? Look there. Look in that 8K. Why pay 25K for a 65 Stratocaster when you can buy one of these things? Beautiful early 60s bound body.
Yeah, the early ones are a great collector guitar. They also play and sound great, and really in the big scheme of guitars, 8,000, 10,000 compared to other brands during that time period is a good value for sure. But I also would encourage anybody who is considering vintage guitars to look at vintage Rickenbackers, because you can get an amazing one for $3,000,
right?
$4,000,
like the solid bodies, like the 625s and the 650s and those kind of things. Those are great guitars.
Oh yeah, the 450 12-string solid body is a fantastic guitar if you want a 12-string on a budget. They're $2,500 all day. Even the semi-hollow or hollow body models like the 330 12. I mean, you can pick those up for $4,000, $4,500, and that's a great value. They're going to be an amazing guitar. If you're specifically looking for something vintage, you have to know what to look out for on them to make sure that it's going to work well and not be problematic. But if you can get a good one in that price range, that's a great way to get into vintage guitars. That's exactly how I got into vintage guitars.
Right.
They were an affordable option at that time.
In 1962, I guess they add this fifth knob. It's called the blend knob. What the hell does that do?
It balances the volume output between the bridge pickup and the neck pickup. Somebody out there listening to this is probably screaming at me because I'm getting it wrong. I'm not a technical guy, but when you turn that knob, the volume on the neck pickup will go up to match the bridge pickup. And so you really notice it when you plug in a Rico sound, the stereo, into two different amps. You twist that knob, it pans from left to right because it uses both pickups on the guitar. So it's pretty interesting. I think for the most part, a lot of people just open that fifth knob wide up, and that's understandable. But if you're looking to balance out the volume between them,
I've been told that most people don't even use it. They don't park it on one end or the other when it sounds good, and they're good with it.
That's right. Yep.
What about the Rico sound?
Yeah. Well, just like Gretsch and Gibson, Rickenbacker thought, hey, a stereo guitar is what people need, but they were smart about it, because unlike the ES345 or ES355 TDSV or the Gretsch models, they put two inputs on their stereo guitars. One Rico sound and one standard jack. So you can use it without the Rico sound, no problem. But if you plug a standard jack into the Rico sound, you're only going to get output from one pickup. So,
So let me ask you. So Rickenbacker, what should everybody have at least one of? If they're going to have one Rickenbacker, what would it be?
Yeah, that's
their desert. What is their desert island Rickenbacker?
If I had to say one Rickenbacker, make it if that's to be a vintage Rickenbacker, make it a 60s era hollow body 12 string. So whether that's a 360 12 from 65 to 70, or a 330 12 from 65 to 70, in terms of value, if you don't have any other Rickenbackers and you want one to really scratch that itch and fit in the collection nicely,
nothing will sound like it. You can't even come close to sounding like that.
No, they really don't. And that's just it. If you're into recording, or if you want to make the same sounds on a lot of your favorite records, there's only one way to do that with the Rickenbacker. I've had the Fender Electric 12. It's great. It doesn't sound like a Rickenbacker.
Nope.
I've had Gibson 12 string. It's not the same.
Yep. Now that as far as restringing it, is that a major pain in the ass trying to figure that out?
People complain about that a lot, but maybe I've just done it enough, and with practice it becomes easy. But I can restring a Rickenbacker in 30, 35 minutes.
Wow.
I
can't even. I have Electric 12, Fender Electric 12. If a string breaks, it never gets replaced, man.
Oh wow, yeah. Well, the trick is putting some tape underneath the tailpiece to hold all the strings in place while
Yeah,
you're
that's
taping
true.
them up.
I've seen
That's
people
easy.
like I can't even restring something that has a Bigsby on it. Like I don't need. I just like to me it's like, well, these strings are 5 years old. I'm not changing them because I don't know how to deal with that. The Rickenbacker, I have to bring it to somebody. I'll bring it to you, and you can restring it. Help me restring
Yeah, sure thing.
it. Now here's the thing. What's the vintage period for Rickenbacker?
Well, like you had mentioned earlier, that Rickenbacker's been around for over 90 years now, so they have all these different chapters in them. And there's like the pre FC Hall chapter that ends when he gets the company in 54.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have, in my opinion, the vintage era from 53, 54, somewhere in there until about 1973, what I would call the golden era of vintage Rickenbackers. All the specs that people like, those big, wide, sparkly, full width inlays on the fretboards and the checkered binding on a lot of the models and the bases, like the toaster pickups, all that kind of stuff ended, depending on the model, around the end of 1973. And so
right,
that kind of is a real line in the sand. Unlike all the other brands, like unlike Gibson and Fender and Gretsch, Rickenbacker never changed hands. It's still family owned by the Hall family now, like it has been since 1953. They haven't had periods where the quality dips so bad that you need to avoid a certain era. Like they've always been great guitars, but there's spec changes, and so you have like that vintage period until 73. You have kind of a transition period from 74 to around 1984 when FC Hall sells the Rickenbacker brand to his son, John Hall. Didn't give it to him, sold it to him in 1984, and he formed Rickenbacker International Corporation, the Rick as we know it today, and that kind of is a clear line in the sand of like the modern era for Rickenbacker. After that point came all the reissues and all the newer, the artist LE models and all kinds of amazing things have come since that point.
Right. And I think they have so many the reissues. When I get a Rickenbacker sale, like when I get a record from somebody who sold, it's going to be a reissue. It's very, very rare that I actually have a true 62 something or a Capri or you know what I mean? It's very rare. It's always going to be the John Lennon such and such or the John K 381 or you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's very rare that you actually get the real thing. So today you could buy, like a nice, well-made Rickenbacker. Would it be cheaper than to buy an actual 67, 72 vintage model?
Well, it depends on the model. Are you talking about buying like a brand new Rickenbacker or like a reissue?
Yeah, or the reissues that they make.
Oh yeah. It's still far less expensive to buy a reissue today, and they're fantastic guitars made to a high standard like that. They still serve their purpose there, and to a great extent, they're better built than a lot of the 60s. If
that's what I was going to say. It's kind of like the Gretsch stuff that you buy today. It's almost more expensive than the 70s Gretches, but you're going to be 1,000 times happier.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's true. I don't know if that'd be true for Rickenbacker.
Especially if you're a touring musician or you're gigging a lot. Like the newer ones, and I'd say anything made in the last 40 years is going to be very high quality, very rugged compared to the originals. Like the 60s era models, especially the 12 strings, they had a lot of neck set issues where there was really high tolerances for the neck pockets and things like that. You add string tension from 12 strings, and all of a sudden the action's high and the bridge is low and the guitar doesn't play that well. That is not really a problem at all with anything made from the mid or early 80s onward.
Right. What happens if you have a neck through body model, like the tulip shape? If the neck's problems, there's nothing you can do about that, is there?
There's some things that people can do, like steaming the neck in some cases, depending on if it has a twist or if it has if it's pitching forward. There's a couple of tricks you can do.
There's a lot of work involved, right, in order to get that thing back to.
And a lot of people don't know how to work on them, really, and especially when you're getting into the real complicated fixes like that. There's only a handful of shops in the U.S. that I can think of that would take on a repair like that and do it justice.
And it might not be worth it. It may be doing $5,000 worth of work for a $2,000 guitar,
Yeah.
Which I've done. I've done that, for sentimental things. I've paid a lot of money to have necks fixed on things that were very sentimental to me. Well, anyways, this was fun. I now hope that people listening to this will now know you're a vintage guitar collector. If you don't have something magical from Rickenbacker in your collection, I wouldn't consider you like you're missing something. There's something that you're about to discover something. And I hope everybody goes out and it just tries, play it, try it. Are you going to plug it into a Marshall and use a wah-wah pedal? Probably not, but you're gonna get something completely different from it.
And Rickenbacker enthusiasts are really passionate about them. I know several collectors that's all they collect is Rickenbackers or vintage Rickenbackers. So there's an enthusiast community out there for these things. I'm kind of all over the place. Like if anybody wants to connect with me at any point, I'm at Instagram. My handles at high.numbers.
Mm-hmm.
You can see. I have. I'm into all kinds of guitars, Gibson, Fender, you name it. But I've always had a passion for Rickenbacker, and that's always going to be there.
You're my go-to guy when it comes to Rickenbackers, and you really helped me get this the Vintage Guitar Magazine guide, kind of just where it was focused properly on Rickenbacker models. Understand, because we had everything in there when the production numbers were 0 or 2, 3,
Yeah.
And you're telling me why would you give a price for something that does not exist?
Yep.
So
that's certainly true.
And I got caught kind of with my pants down, as they say.
Well, the new price guide is the best one yet. So in terms of vintage Rickenbacker price,
and everybody, I want everybody to thank Collin. He was the guy that sat with me for hours, right, going through this, making sure we were right on everything. So as of today, that 2025 guide is on the nose for Rickenbackers. You're not going to, like I say, the dealers out there some of these dealers do not ever see Rickenbackers. But we went right to the source, as they say. So
fantastic.
Thank you so much, Collin. This was a lot of fun. I hope, I know that you were busy today.
Thank you, Ram. I always have time to talk guitars and Rickenbackers especially. I always love it.
And we're gonna talk again in about 3 months when I finalize numbers again. I'll do my, like I do for every couple of months I finalize numbers. Do you think the market has changed for Rickenbackers in the last year?
A little bit. Rickenbackers have weathered multiple economic cycles, and because they didn't go up really quickly during COVID, they haven't gone down really quickly since COVID. It's pretty strong, I would say, but it's not the type of thing to buy and expect it to be doubling in value next year. It's just not. It's something
right, and that's never been the case for Rickenbacker. However, 5 years ago, you could have doubled your money with some models, for sure.
Some ones, yeah, exactly.
Yep. Perfect. Thank you again. I appreciate your giving me your time today, and everybody else now knows more about Rickenbackers than they ever thought they would. And explore, people. Go out there and explore the whole world. Another world out there for you. That Stratocaster on your wall needs a 360-12 standing next to it.
Nice. Thanks, Ram.
All righty. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to Buy That Guitar, presented by Vintage Guitar Magazine. Please support VG for all they do for guitar players like us. Please subscribe, like, share, and comment on this podcast. I'd love to hear from you at ram@vintageguitar.com. See you again next week. Bye-bye.
The official Vintage Guitar Magazine 2025 price guide has partnered with 33 of the top guitar dealers in the industry to provide the most accurate values for thousands of models. This includes electric guitars, acoustic guitars, basses, amplifiers, effects, mandolins, and banjos. Whether your instrument is an investment or simply a piece you enjoy playing, it's always helpful to know what it's worth. If you're checking out a guitar at your local shop and want to know its value before making the purchase, this guide is your go-to source for all the details. Available in both print and digital editions, you can have the guide right at your fingertips no matter where you go. Use code BUYGUITAR25 to receive 15% off the 2025 price guide when purchased directly from www.vintageguitar.com.
Offer expires February 11th, 2025.